Energy Policy Watch goes behind the scenes of energy policy in progress. Join Jack Belcher, a principal for advisory services at noted government affairs consultancy Cornerstone, for thoughtful bipartisan discussions with policymakers, elected representatives, and subject matter experts as he examines the regulatory environment, proposed regulations, and rulemaking at every stage in this exclusive Heart Energy video series.
Welcome to Energy Policy Watch. I'm Jack Belcher. Our guest today is Congresswoman Lizzie Fletcher from Texas's 7th Congressional District here on the west side of Houston, and our studio is here in her district. She serves on the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee. Welcome, Congresswoman Fletcher.
Thank you, Jack. I'm glad to be with you.
Energy Policy Watch is a partnership between Hart Energy and Cornerstone Government Affairs. We interview public figures and energy policy experts about important issues impacting the oil and gas industry. We're looking forward to your insights on everything that's going on in Washington that's important to the industry. First, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your goals and vision?
Sure. Well, I'm glad to, Jack, thanks for the invitation. And of course, I'm glad to be here to talk with you about energy policy, specifically a little bit about myself. I represent Texas's 7th Congressional District on the west side of Houston, and I have lived in this district nearly all of my life, born and raised here in Houston, and worked for about a decade, a little bit more than that, as a lawyer here in Houston, where I worked with folks in all sectors of the industry and learned a bit about energy issues, but certainly don't consider myself an expert. But I do think that my constituents are experts, and I've been really glad to partner with them and work with them as we talk about our energy future. Obviously, as you know, conversations about our energy future, whether it's our fuel sources, our infrastructure, our technologies, our supplies, present and anticipated future demand, all those conversations are happening in Washington and, of course, here in my home in Houston, as well as across the country. So I'm glad to share my perspective with you, as well as my hope for how we as a country can have this conversation. And maybe that's a good place to start and kind of set the tone for our conversation, because there's
Sure.
so much happening in the energy space. Much of it is exciting and innovative, and some of it, things we didn't even imagine a decade ago. But with that, there's a lot of disruption and a lot of uncertainty. And that makes it a complex policy space as well as a complex political space. And in my view, the best thing we can do for everyone is depoliticize the conversation about our energy future.
Congresswoman, you have a very interesting role to play as a pro-oil and gas Democrat from the Houston area. Can you tell us a little bit about the challenges and opportunities that you have in that role?
Sure, I'm glad to, because I think there's really no question more critical to our energy future, to our community's future, than how we address the dual challenge of producing energy for the world while also reducing harmful emissions and battling climate change. And of course, lots of people are talking about that. So, despite what some people would have you believe, being a pro-energy Democrat is a good place to be. There are more pro-energy Democrats than some might realize. I co-chair the Natural Gas Caucus. I'm also a member of the Oil and Gas Caucus, which is made up of all Democrats. And certainly there's a lot of diversity of opinion in our caucus and diversity of experience and priorities on all kinds of matters, including energy policy. But what I've found is that the majority of my colleagues want smart, thoughtful, and engaged policy, especially when we're talking about our energy future and what it will actually look like. And I think it's particularly true with complex energy policy because it's complex. Energy policy and climate policy. I was just on a call recently with about a dozen of my colleagues, with Daniel Yergin, kind of digging into the details. Really trying to understand the whole energy ecosystem that, for the most part, isn't well understood. I think we've had generally reliable, affordable, and abundant energy that has enabled and empowered us. But we have a lot of questions that we're asking now, and I think there are a lot of opportunities to engage. So, I find that, like I said, the majority of my colleagues are really receptive to hearing me, to hearing my perspective. And I'm so glad to serve on the Energy and Commerce Committee, where I have the opportunity to shape legislation as it's being crafted and bring the perspective of the energy capital of the world to the discussion. I think it's an absolutely vital place for us to be. So I'm really glad to be able to do that and represent this district in Congress.
Well, it's really is striking a balance. And we see a lot of sweeping proposals right now in Congress about climate, about oil and gas development. And we know that a lot of the proposals that pass in the House are not going to end up passing in the Senate. So there's going to be a limited number of bills that are likely to go all the way through. Could you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on climate and energy legislation that's likely to be able to pass in those areas where there seems to be some opportunities for consensus and compromise?
Sure, I think there's actually a lot of bills. There's kind of the big picture question on overall energy policy and climate policy, and I think that what I'm seeing is a real interest in doing both of those things. Where I see a lot of opportunity for consensus, where I see a lot of people working together, is around this idea of emissions reduction, and that's something that we see right here in Houston, right? As I love to tell people over and over, right? Houston's the energy capital of the world. Texas is an energy producing state, and here we believe in climate change. We've experienced its effects, and we are actively working to solve the problems that present. So I think that the key for us is really figuring out how we can work together on these issues, and how we can find the bills, like you said, that have a possibility of making it through the House and the Senate, being signed into law by the president. And I think there's a ton that's in front of us. So the Energy and Commerce Committee will likely be moving on the Clean Future Act framework, which includes a variety of provisions designed to accelerate the deployment of clean energy technology. We're also expecting legislation to make reforms aimed at modernizing the U.S. energy markets, starting with the FERC, as well as to address some of the market barriers for new entrants and emerging technologies, facilitate integration of clean and renewable resources onto the grid, and provide for retail choice of clean energy. As I know you're aware, working on President Biden's infrastructure plan, the American Jobs Plan, it's an opportunity to focus on relief from the pandemic, and also to create jobs and spur the economy, as well as to build in a way where we develop a modern energy infrastructure. So there's a lot of interest in infrastructure, recognizing, of course, that a lot of our energy infrastructure is private investment, but thinking about the ways that we can facilitate that. And a lot of that comes around certainty with regulations and an understanding of what the future may hold. The other thing where I see a lot of bipartisan opportunities is to invest in a lot of the programs that were authorized in last year's Energy Act, which was signed into law as part of the year-end appropriations bill. And those investments create energy innovation and research that I know companies here in my district are already working on. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to see some good, thoughtful energy policy moving forward that will have bipartisan support and has a real possibility of being signed into law.
You mentioned the Energy Act, and that was passed at the end of last year. Can you tell us a little bit about the importance of technology and innovation in helping us meet the climate and energy challenges that we're facing?
Yeah, I think that bill was really important in authorizing programs that make serious federal investments in developing critical energy technologies that we will rely on in our energy mix for the next century. I worked on several of the proposals in the last Congress when I was the chair of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee's Energy Subcommittee, and I spoke about them recently, actually, with Secretary Granholm. One of the things it included was the Fossil Energy Research and Development Act, which invests in the research and development of large-scale demonstration of carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology. I think that is a critical piece of our path forward in meeting our energy needs and reducing our carbon emissions. I've met with a lot of companies in my district that are ready to implement these carbon capture projects. So I think that that's one great example. It's a great opportunity to address carbon, to use nature-based solutions, as well as new technologies. And I think it'll be a major focus of our work moving forward in this Congress as well. There's a lot of bipartisan support for it. And there are a lot of things that are connected with that. And I think that overall there are a lot of different programs and demonstrations and grant programs, to make the investments in technology now that will make a difference over time. But what I've heard, especially from people in my district, is emphasizing really the need for government to support to get some of these real big projects off the ground. So that's one example, but there are a lot of opportunities in front of us, and I think now is the time to seize them.
It's a really important example. We're hearing so much talk now about CCUS and actual projects that are, looking at getting funded and moving forward. So it's absolutely important, increasingly, it seems, in the sector. So in light of some of the recent executive orders on oil and gas activities on federal lands, I know that's something that a lot of the producers are concerned about, the pause that's taken place and what that means kind of long term. Can you talk a little bit about, how we ensure that oil and gas activities continue to take place on federal lands and the offshore? Because there is a lot of concern about that.
Yeah, I'm glad to. And as I think maybe everyone doesn't know, but I opposed the president's executive orders to slow down the issuance of new oil and gas drilling permits on federal lands. And I also don't believe we should be slowing down oil and gas offshore leasing. With the new administration, I want to emphasize the importance of really sound policy on permitting. And I think, we're starting to see things moving in the right direction. Part of how we do that is making sure that we have a seat at the table and are engaging constructively in the dialogue about these issues. One of the things, for example, that I experienced in the last Congress, we voted on some offshore drilling bans that I opposed. And interestingly, there was bipartisan support for those bans. And I worked with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to kind of help educate and talk about why they weren't consistent with our climate objectives. Opponents of offshore drilling will often cite the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in calls for banning offshore leasing, for example. But, it's much more complex. I'm often reminding people that the domestic production of oil and natural gas has led to the largest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the power sector over the last decade, and that the deepwater sites in the Gulf of Mexico produce some of the lowest greenhouse gas intense volumes of oil and gas in the world. So, people need to know that and understand that. But the only way they know it is if you have the opportunity to talk and engage and really work through this collaboratively and as a partner to kind of start with shared values and shared objectives, and then work backwards into the best way to get there. And I think the question for us when it comes to some of these issues is that experts agree that global demand is going to continue to grow, and the question is really, who do we want producing oil and gas? Companies here in the United States know how to produce cleaner energy on our lands and off of our shores. And with domestic production, another important thing we have is the opportunity for better protections for our environment, for our workers. I tell my colleagues all the time about how so many of the meetings that I go to in Houston start with a safety moment, right? Those are things we value: worker safety, environmental safety. And, we are better off having our oil and gas production from here in the United States. And that we want to continue to be the leaders when it comes to oil and gas production, as well as all energy production, right? But we need certainty in the policymaking to help stakeholders plan for the future. So I've been working with the administration to work with us to develop policy that isn't seen as temporary. And I think it's important, kind of going back to my original point about depoliticizing the conversation. I think what I hear from the people that I represent is that we need policy that doesn't change every 2 or 4 years. And I think that kind of approach is what we need, because having policy that changes every 2 years or every 4 years won't get us where we need to be in achieving our climate goals or our energy goals.
Well, that's great, and great points. And it's great that you're able to do that educating, because it really, it needs to be done, constantly educating your fellow members about the importance of oil and gas and the role that natural gas has played in reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. And also, you talked about international. I mean, it has a huge role to play globally in helping reduce emissions through our LNG exports. So Appreciate that you're spreading the word there. Well, Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your insights. And thank you to our viewers. If you would like to be a guest on Energy Policy Watch or would like to learn more about our show, log on to energypolicywatch.com. Goodbye.